For most of human history, a person was never truly alone, and that raises a quiet question. Not a dramatic one, not one that demands an urgent answer, but a slow and thoughtful one, the kind that settles into the mind the way dusk settles over an open field. The question is simply this: what did it mean to be human before the idea of privacy ever existed? What did daily life feel like when every moment was shared, when every breath was witnessed, when solitude was not a luxury or a right, but something closer to a danger, a punishment, or an impossibility? To answer that question honestly, we have to travel very far back. We have to move past everything we think we know about human life and begin again, somewhere much older and much quieter than the world we inhabit today. The story of human privacy, or rather the story of its absence, begins not with philosophy or law or architecture. It begins with the body. It begins with the biology of a species that spent the overwhelming majority of its existence living in small, tightly bound groups, pressed together against the cold, the dark, and the vast indifference of the natural world. For approximately 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in bands, not cities, not villages, not even the loose collections of huts we might imagine when we think of ancient life. Bands. Small, mobile, deeply interconnected groups of human beings who moved together across landscapes, who slept together in the same sheltered spaces, who ate together from the same sources, who raised children together, who mourned together, who were sick together, who recovered together or did not recover together. In these groups, the average number of individuals was somewhere between 15 and 50. Some researchers suggest the number could rise to 150 during seasonal gatherings, a figure now associated with what the anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed as the natural cognitive limit of human social connection. But the core living unit, the group that moved and camped and survived together day after day, was small, intimate in ways that go far beyond the modern meaning of that word. In that world there was no door to close, there was no room of one's own, there was no corridor to walk down in the morning before the rest of the household woke, there was no moment of quiet coffee before the day began, no commute taken alone, no hour of reading in a private corner. Everything that happened to a person happened in front of others. Sleep was shared, illness was witnessed, birth was communal, death was public. The body, in all its functions and vulnerabilities and rhythms, was not a private matter. It could not be. The conditions of life did not permit it. If we look deeper into what this actually meant in practice, we begin to see something that the modern mind finds genuinely difficult to absorb. The idea that privacy is a natural human need, a fundamental psychological requirement, is so deeply embedded in contemporary culture that it functions almost like a biological fact. We speak of needing space. We speak of needing time alone. We build houses with bedrooms and bathrooms and studies and gardens specifically because solitude is understood as essential to mental health, to creativity, to a dignified life. And yet, from an evolutionary perspective, this need is extremely recent. It is, in the long view of human history, almost brand new. The version of human life in which privacy is expected, in which walls exist to separate one person from another, in which thoughts and feelings are considered inherently personal and inward, that version of human life represents perhaps 10,000 years of experience at most, out of a species history that stretches back over 200,000 years, which means that for roughly 90% of our existence as Homo sapiens, we lived without it entirely. this is not simply a historical curiosity. It has profound implications for how we understand ourselves, how we understand our discomfort, how we understand the particular loneliness of modern life. Because what evolutionary biology and anthropology suggest, when examined carefully and without sentimentality, is that the human animal was not shaped by evolution to need solitude, it was shaped by evolution to need company, deep, constant, uninterrupted company. And the world we have built, the world of separate rooms and private thoughts and quiet evenings alone, is a world that our bodies and brains are still in many ways trying to figure out how to inhabit. To understand how thoroughly woven into human life this togetherness once was, it helps to spend some time inside the daily rhythms of a hunter-gatherer band. Anthropologists have studied contemporary hunter-gatherer societies extensively. Groups like the San people of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Agta of the Philippines, and many others. And while these societies exist in a modern world and cannot be considered direct windows into the ancient past, they offer something invaluable, a sense of what life organised around mobility, small groups, and shared resources actually looks and feels like. And one of the most consistent features of these societies, observed across vastly different geographies and cultures, is the near total absence of anything resembling privacy as we understand it today. In a Hadza camp, for instance, people sleep in small shelters made from branches and leaves, arranged in close proximity to one another. The distance between one family's sleeping space and another's is often no more than a few feet. Conversations carry easily, sounds of the night, breathing, coughing, the movement of bodies, the murmuring of parents to children are simply part of the shared acoustic environment. There is no expectation that these things will be contained or hidden. Information flows freely through the camp. Who is feeling ill? Who has argued with whom? Who has found food? Who has failed to find food? Who is pregnant? Who is grieving? All of this is part of the collective knowledge of the group, not because people are nosy or intrusive by nature, but because this kind of shared awareness is functionally necessary in a world where survival depends on coordination and mutual support. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes complete sense. Natural selection does not favour traits that are philosophically appealing. It favours traits that help organisms survive and reproduce. And in the environment in which our ancestors lived, the environment of the African savanna, the open woodland, the seasonal migration route, isolation was genuinely dangerous. A human being alone was a human being at risk. Alone you could not defend yourself against predators effectively. Alone you could not care for yourself when ill. Alone you could not find food consistently enough to survive a difficult season. Alone you were, in biological terms, already in serious trouble. The group was not just a social preference. It was a life support system. This is why loneliness, even today, produces such a visceral and specific kind of pain. Research in social neuroscience has shown that the experience of loneliness activates many of the same neural pathways as physical pain. This is not a metaphor. It is a biological response shaped by millions of years of evolution designed to motivate the lonely individual to seek reconnection with others. The pain of loneliness is, in this sense, structurally similar to the pain of hunger. Both are distress signals from a body that recognizes a dangerous deficit. Just as hunger says you need to find food before you weaken and die, loneliness says you need to find your group before isolation becomes fatal. In the ancestral environment, that warning was urgently accurate. To be cut off from your bed was, in many realistic scenarios, a death sentence. Understanding this helps explain something that puzzles many people about modern social life: why solitude, which we conceptually value and often desperately seek, so frequently makes us feel worse rather than better. Why we reach for our phones the moment we are alone. Why silence, even when chosen, can feel uncomfortable. Why the quiet of an empty apartment at night sometimes carries a weight that the rational mind cannot fully account for. The evolutionary answer is that our nervous systems evolved in an environment where silence usually meant danger and company meant safety. The rustling of the camp, the low voices of others nearby, the warmth of bodies close at hand in sleep. These were the sensory cues that told the ancestral nervous system, "You are safe, you're not alone, you are what you should be." Their absence still registers in some deep, pre-rational part of the brain as a warning. But let us return to the ancient world itself and trace how the absence of privacy shaped every dimension of early human life, not just the emotional or psychological dimension. Consider, to begin with, the question of sleeping. In contemporary life, sleep is among the most private of human activities. We sleep behind closed doors, usually with only a partner or alone, in dedicated spaces that are considered off-limits during sleeping hours, in beds that are understood as deeply personal territory. The idea of strangers watching us sleep, or of sleeping in the same undivided space as dozens of other people, strikes most modern people as somewhere between uncomfortable and disturbing. And yet, for the vast majority of human history, sleeping communally was simply the norm, not a compromised or degraded version of sleep, but the only version that existed. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa, Europe and Asia consistently suggests that early humans sheltered together in ways that left no room for individual sleeping quarters. Rock shelters, the most durable of early human habitations, show evidence of multiple hearths clustered together, of bones and tools distributed in patterns that suggest shared use of the space rather than individual ownership. At sites like Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa, where human habitation stretched back over 160,000 years, there is no indication of divided interior space, no early equivalent of the private bedroom. The shelter was shared, the sleeping was communal, and this was not a failure of social organisation, but an expression of it. The hearth itself tells an important story in this regard. Fire, which Homo sapiens used with increasing sophistication over hundreds of thousands of years, was a communal resource by its very nature. It required fuel that had to be collectively gathered. It required tending through the night. It provided warmth and light and protection from predators in a radius that encompassed the group, not its individual. To sleep near the fire was to sleep near others. The warmth was shared, or it was lost. In this sense, the physical structure of survival, the fire, the shelter, a food cache, the water source, encoded togetherness into the very fabric of daily life. Privacy was not simply a social preference that had not yet developed. It was architecturally impossible. Consider also the matter of food. In modern life, eating is often private or semi-private affair. We eat alone at our desks or in the car, or standing at the kitchen counter. Even when we eat with others, the expectation is that each person has their own portion, their own plate, their own relationship with the food in front of them. The idea that a stranger might watch closely how much you eat, comment on it, or share directly from your portion without asking, strikes most contemporary people as invasive, And yet in hunter-gatherer societies, food sharing is not merely customary but morally obligatory. The anthropological literature on this is extensive and consistent. Among the Hadza, among the San, among virtually every documented foraging society, meat in particular, the result of a successful hunt, is distributed according to established social rules that ensure broad sharing across the group. A hunter who attempts to keep a large kill for himself alone is not merely breaking a social custom. He is violating something close to a moral law, one enforced by the collective disapproval of the group. This kind of obligatory sharing has deep roots. From an evolutionary perspective, it represents what researchers call reciprocal altruism, a strategy in which individuals give away resources in the present with the expectation, encoded in social norms rather than explicit contract, that they will receive in return during future times of need. Food sharing in hunter-gatherer bands is essentially a distributed insurance system. When you share your kill today, you're not just being generous. You are banking social credit against the day when you return from the hunt empty-handed and your family is hungry. In this system, hoarding is not just selfish, it is strategically irrational and socially catastrophic. And for this system to function, the amount of food any individual has must be visible, known to the group. Private food caches undermine the entire architecture of shared survival. Transparency about resources is not a violation of privacy in this context. It is the very mechanism by which the group stays alive together. If we look deeper at the social structure of early human bands, we find a similar pattern, extending across virtually every domain of life. Knowledge was communal. Skills were taught openly, in front of others, passed down through observation and participation, rather than through private instruction or hoarded expertise. The person who knew how to make a particular kind of tool, or how to track a specific animal, or how to find water in an arid landscape, shared that knowledge as a matter of survival imperative. The extinction of a skill within a group was a genuine threat. Archaeological evidence suggests that some early human populations actually lost important technologies, the ability to make certain kinds of tools, for instance. When population sizes dropped too low for effective knowledge transmission, the group was the library. If the library burned, the knowledge was gone. In early human environments, emotional life was similarly public in ways that are difficult for the modern mind to fully reconstruct. The containment of emotion, the private processing of grief or fear or shame in solitude, the management of difficult feelings in the interior of one's own experience before presenting a composed exterior to the world, is a practice that requires architecture, time, and cultural permission. It requires a room to retreat to, a door to close, a culture that defines the interior life as personal and therefore protected from collective scrutiny. None of these things existed in the world of our ancestors. Grief was expressed communally, as witnessed communally. Fear was visible and shared. The social rituals around death, childbirth, illness and conflict were participatory because participation was the only available mode of response. There was no infrastructure for privacy, even if the cultural impulse existed. This raises an important question about the relationship between privacy and the self as we understand it today. The philosopher Charles Taylor has written extensively about what he calls the modern notion of inwardness, the idea, which emerged gradually through Western intellectual history, that human beings have a deep interior life that is fundamentally their own, separate from the social world and in some sense more real and more authentic than the public self they present to others. This idea, which feels to most contemporary people like a simple and obvious fact of human experience, is actually quite historically specific. It has roots in ancient Greek philosophy, was developed significantly in Christian theological traditions, and came into its fullest elaboration during the Enlightenment and Romantic periods. The notion that you have a private self that is more truly you than your social self, that your thoughts and feelings are yours in a way that your behaviour in public is not. This is an idea with a history, and it is surprisingly short history by the standards of the human species. For most of human existence, identity was not primarily interior, it was relational. You were who you were in relation to your group, your role, your status, your obligations, your story. All of these were defined not in the privacy of your own reflection, but in the ongoing web of relationships and interactions that constituted daily life. The self was, in a very real sense, a social production, not in the cynical or reductive sense that it was merely performed or constructed for an audience, but in the deeper sense that the self emerged from and was sustained by constant social interaction in a way that made the concept of a purely private inner life largely incoherent. You did not go away and think about who you were. You were who you were in the act of living with others. This is not to say that early humans had no inner life, no individuality, no personal perspective on the world. The archaeological record, the evidence from contemporary foraging societies, and basic reasoning about what it means to be a thinking, feeling creature all suggest the contrary. Individual personality, individual preference, individual perspective, these were almost certainly present in human populations from the very beginning. What was absent was the cultural and architectural infrastructure that allowed that inner life to be understood as private, in the modern sense, as fundamentally separate from the social world, as belonging to the individual rather than the community, as requiring protection from collective access. The question of when privacy began to emerge as a distinct value is one of the most interesting questions in the archaeology of everyday life. The answers are tentative and contested, but they point consistently in the same direction. Toward the Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, when human populations in various parts of the world began the transition from mobile foraging to settled agriculture. This transition, which historians sometimes call the Neolithic Revolution, was one of the most consequential events in human history. Not because it produced immediate abundance or immediate improvement in quality of life. The evidence suggests the contrary on both counts, at least in the short term, but because it fundamentally changed the spatial organisation of human social life in ways that eventually made privacy both possible and necessary. When humans began to farm, they became sedentary. Sedentary life produced permanent architecture. Permanent architecture produced enclosed spaces. Enclosed spaces produced the physical possibility of separation, of one family's life being at least partially shielded from the direct observation of another. The first houses were not private in a modern sense. The archaeological evidence from early Neolithic settlements like Çatalhöyük in what is now central Turkey, a site dating back approximately 9,000 years, suggests that even in these early permanent communities, life was extraordinarily communal by contemporary standards. Houses were clustered so tightly together that the rooftops served as communal walkways. There were no streets. Entry into dwellings was through openings in the roof. The population of Çatalhöyük at its height may have been as high as 8,000 people living in extraordinary physical proximity. And yet even in this densely communal world, we begin to see the first faint traces of spatial differentiation. Within individual structures at Cataluyuk, archaeologists have identified distinct activity zones, areas apparently designated for sleeping, for food preparation, for storage. The surfaces of different zones show different patterns of use. Some areas were plastered and replastered repeatedly, suggesting they were considered cleaner or more important than others. Burial of the dead within the floors of houses suggests a deep identification of domestic space with family identity that begins to hint at the much later concept of the home as a private domain. These are early, uncertain, easily overstated signs, but they point in a direction. As agriculture developed and deepened over the millennia, settlements grew into villages, and villages grew into towns, and towns grew into the first cities. The physical and social organization of human life continued to evolve in ways that gradually created more and more space for something like privacy to exist. Not privacy as a right, not privacy as a philosophical value, but privacy as a practical fact of daily life. The simple reality that walls and distance and the increasing complexity of social organization meant that not everything about a person's life was visible to everyone around them at all times. This was a genuinely new development in human experience, and its consequences were profound and far-reaching in ways that we are perhaps only beginning to fully understand. Consider what it meant for the organization of thought. Cognitive scientists and psychologists who study the relationship between environment and cognition have found consistent evidence that private space enables particular kinds of thinking that are more difficult in communal environments. Deep concentration, the kind required for sustained creative or analytical work, is easier in the absence of social stimuli. Extended planning, the kind that requires holding complex future scenarios in mind over time, is facilitated by uninterrupted quiet. The development of a coherent personal narrative, the sense of oneself as a continuous entity moving through time, is supported by periods of solitary reflection. None of this means that these cognitive capacities did not exist before private space did. But it does suggest that the creation of private space may have enabled the development of certain kinds of complex thinking in ways that the communal world of the forager could not. From an evolutionary perspective, this is one of the many ways in which the Neolithic transition opened new cognitive territory. The shift to agriculture did not simply change what people did with their time. It changed the environment in which the brain developed and operated, and it created conditions under which new kinds of mental activity became possible. The writing of extended philosophical texts, the systematic planning of large construction projects, the development of legal codes, the creation of complex theological systems, all of these developments, which occurred in the ancient civilizations that grew from early agricultural settlements, required sustained and focused individual intellectual effort in ways that the rhythm of nomadic foraging life may not easily have permitted. But it is important not to idealize this transition or to describe it as simple progress. The emergence of private space and private life brought with it not only new cognitive possibilities, but new psychological burdens. Loneliness as a chronic condition rather than an occasional experience may be in part a product of the increasing privatization of life that began with the Neolithic revolution and has accelerated continuously ever since. The conditions of communal forager life, for all their lack of privacy and solitude, provided something that the increasingly atomized social structures of settled civilization have often struggled to replicate: a constant, reliable, embodied sense of belonging. Research on contemporary hunter-gatherer societies consistently finds low rates of the kind of chronic unsocial isolation that is associated with modern depression and anxiety. This is not because forager life is idyllic or free from hardship. It is not by any measure. But the structural conditions of that life guarantee a level of social contact and collective belonging that has become, in the modern world, something that individuals must actively seek and often fail to find. The Hadza elder who sits in camp surrounded by the constant low-level activity and conversation of his community is embedded in social life in a way that the person living alone in a modern apartment, however many social media connections they maintain, is fundamentally not. This is not a simple argument that we should return to forager life or that privacy is bad. It is a more subtle observation that the balance we have struck between togetherness and privacy in modern life is historically unusual, and that our biology was shaped by a very different balance, and that understanding this gap might help explain certain features of the modern psychological life that otherwise seem puzzling. The epidemic of loneliness in contemporary developed societies, a public health crisis now documented extensively in research across Europe, North America, and increasingly other parts of the world, is not simply the result of individual failures of social effort. It is, in part, the result of living in social structures that have, over millennia, progressively dismantled the communal conditions in which human beings spent almost all of their evolutionary history. The architecture of modern life encodes solitude in ways that our ancestors would have found extraordinary. Consider the single-family home, which became the dominant residential ideal across much of the Western world during the 20th century. This architectural form, one family separated from all other families by walls and a yard, with individual bedrooms for each child, a private kitchen, a private bathroom, a private living space, represents a degree of spatial separation between human beings that has no precedent in the vast majority of human history. Even the urban apartment, often criticized in contemporary culture for its cramped communality, provides a degree of privacy that would have seemed almost incomprehensible to a hunter-gatherer who spent every night of their life sleeping within arm's reach of at least a dozen other people. And yet this architecture of solitude has not made us feel more peaceful or more whole. It has, in many documented ways, made us feel more isolated and more anxious. This is one of the great paradoxes of modern life. We have built a world to optimize for privacy, and in that world the thing many people most acutely miss is genuine connection. The solution is not to tear down the walls. It is perhaps to understand more clearly why the walls feel both necessary and insufficient. To recognize that the discomfort we feel in forced solitude and the discomfort we feel in enforced proximity are both expressions of the same underlying evolutionary reality. We are a deeply social species shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of living in constant intimate togetherness, and we are now navigating a world that looks almost nothing like the one in which that shaping took place. If we look at the question from a different angle, not the perspective of what we have lost, but the perspective of what privacy has made possible, the picture becomes more complex and more interesting. Because it would be wrong to describe the emergence of privacy in human life simply as a loss of communal warmth. Privacy has also been one of the preconditions for some of the most significant developments in human intellectual and cultural life, the capacity for sustained inner contemplation that private space enables has been essential to the development of written literature, philosophy, and science. The sense of the interior life as significant and worth attending to, which privacy both reflects and reinforces, has given rise to forms of art and expression that could not have emerged from a purely communal social world. The protection of the individual from the full weight of collective scrutiny and social pressure has created conditions under which nonconformity, dissent, and innovation have been able to survive and flourish. In early human environments, the pressure of constant collective observation was not merely comfortable togetherness. It was also a powerful mechanism of social conformity. In small, tightly interdependent groups, the consequences of social disapproval are immediate and significant. A person who behaves in ways that the group finds unacceptable does not simply face abstract social consequences. They face the possibility of reduced cooperation, reduced food sharing, reduced support in times of illness or vulnerability. In short, reduced survival prospects. The group's gaze is not only warm, it is also a form of regulation. And in the ancestral environment, that regulation was comprehensive and inescapable precisely because there was no private space into which one could retreat from it. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote, in her landmark work on the public and private realms, that the private sphere has historically served as a space of protection, a place where the individual could exist outside the demands and judgments of the public world. To be deprived of a private sphere, she argued, was not merely an inconvenience but a form of deprivation of a fundamental dimension of human dignity. What is interesting about this argument, when placed in the context of evolutionary history, is that it suggests the emergence of privacy was not simply a development in social organization. It was, in a real sense, the creation of a new kind of human experience, an experience of the self as having an interior that belongs to itself, as being something more than what is visible to the collective eye. This emergence did not happen overnight, and it did not happen uniformly across human cultures. The history of privacy is a history of gradual, uneven, contested development, a slow expansion of the idea that individuals have domains of life that legitimately belong to them and into which others, including the state, do not have the right to intrude. This idea developed at different speeds in different places, and it has never been universally or completely achieved anywhere, even in contemporary societies that enshrine privacy as a legal right. The actual experience of privacy, of having a genuine domain of life that is meaningfully one's own, is distributed very unequally. The wealthy have private homes, private transport, private communications, private healthcare. The poor share spaces, share institutions, are subject to surveillance systems, to social services, to the scrutiny of bureaucracies that monitor their lives in ways that more prosperous citizens rarely experience. The history of privacy is, in part, a history of inequality. But before all of that complexity, before the philosophy and the law and the architecture and the politics, there was simply the ancient world, and in that world the lives of human beings were lived entirely in the open. Not because anyone chose this, not because any philosophy endorsed it, but because the conditions of survival required it, and the technology for anything else did not yet exist. The site came down, and the group gathered around the fire, and the sleeping bodies pressed close together for warmth, and the sounds of one life mixed with the sounds of all the others, and no one thought to call this a deprivation. because no one had yet imagined the alternative. There was something worth sitting with in that image. Not a sentimental nostalgia for a world that was also brutal and short and uncertain in ways we prefer not to dwell on, but a genuine recognition that the way we live now, the walls and the doors and the private thoughts and the solitary evenings, is not the natural state of the human animal. It is an experiment. A very recent and in many ways extraordinary experiment. One that has enabled remarkable things and cost us others, and if we can hold both sides of that truth at once, the value of the private life we've built, and the cost of the communal life we've largely abandoned, we might arrive at something approaching wisdom about what it means to be human in this particular and peculiar moment. The transition from communal to private life did not happen all at once, of course. It was an extraordinarily gradual process, measured not in years or decades but in millennia. And throughout most of that process, life remained far more communal than private by any modern measure. Even as settled civilizations grew and expanded, even as architecture became more elaborate and social hierarchies more complex, the lives of ordinary people, the farmers, the craftspeople, the labourers who constituted the vast majority of the ancient population, continued to be lived in close, constant proximity to others in ways that we would find remarkable today. Consider life in a medieval European village, which is already many thousands of years into the post-forestry era, and yet still a world in which private space is largely the preserve of the wealthy. In the typical peasant household of this medieval period, a single room served as sleeping space, cooking space, living space, and working space for an entire family, often an extended family that included grandparents, unmarried siblings, and sometimes non-related individuals. Animals might share the space in the winter. Visitors arrived without prior arrangement. Illness was nursed in the same room where the family ate and slept. There were no separate bedrooms, no private study, no personal bathroom. What we would now call the most intimate aspects of life, bathing, bodily functions, sexual activity, the processes of illness and dying, were conducted in close proximity to other family members, and the expectation of concealment that we would bring to these activities today was either entirely absent or present only in the most attenuated form. This was not the experience of poverty alone, though poverty certainly made it more extreme. Even in wealthy households of the ancient and medieval worlds, what we would call privacy was a concept only partially realized and unevenly valued. The medieval Great Hall, the center of aristocratic life, was a thoroughly communal space in which lord and servant, family and retainer ate and slept and conducted business in a shared environment. The gradual withdrawal of the wealthy to private chambers, a process archaeologists and historians can trace through changes in the layout of aristocratic residences beginning in the late medieval period, was itself a significant cultural development, one that marked the beginning of a new understanding of what it meant to live a dignified life. It was in this period, and in the Renaissance that followed, that the concept of the private individual began to emerge in something like its modern form in European culture. The development of the private study or cabinet, a small room reserved for an individual's personal work and contemplation, in the houses of wealthy merchants and scholars in 15th and 16th century Europe represents one of the first architectural embodiments of the idea that the individual's interior life deserves a dedicated physical space. The essays of Michel de Montaigne, written in the late 16th century in a tower room at his chateau that he had set aside specifically for private thought and writing, represent a similar development in the cultural domain. an extended introspective exploration of the individual self that would have been difficult to produce, and perhaps difficult even to conceive without the physical conditions that private space provides. So from an evolutionary perspective, this is a fascinating period to contemplate. Here, for the first time in the human history, a small but culturally influential group of people are beginning to develop not just the practice of privacy, but a philosophical framework for understanding why privacy matters and what it makes possible. They are discovering through direct experience that the removal of the social gaze, even temporarily, even partially, opens something up in the mind and the self. They're discovering what the evolutionary biologist might describe as a novel adaptive environment, a set of conditions that our biology was not shaped for, but that our cognitive flexibility allows us to inhabit and gradually to value. This discovery did not happen in isolation from broader social changes. The Renaissance and early modern period in Europe were also the period of the printing press, of rising literacy rates among urban populations, of the emergence of a reading culture in which individuals could consume complex texts in solitude. Reading, the act of sitting alone with a written text and engaging in a private mental conversation with an absent author, is one of the most privacy-dependent of human intellectual activities. It requires quiet, it requires focused individual attention, and it produces a kind of interior experience that is fundamentally personal and not easily shared. The mass spread of reading culture, enabled by the printing press from the mid-15th century onward, was therefore not just a technological change, it was a cognitive and cultural change, one that both required and reinforced the value of private space and private experience. The relationship between reading and privacy is worth dwelling on, because it illuminates something important about why the development of private life and the development of complex inner experience seem to go together in human history. When you read, to truly read with sustained attention, you are having an experience that is fundamentally interior. The images, associations, emotions, and thoughts that a text produces in your mind are yours alone. No one else is having exactly the same experience, even if they are reading the same words. This is one of the things that makes reading feel like an act of self-cultivation. It builds and explores the interior life in ways that communal experience, however rich and valuable, does not. The mass literacy that spread across Europe from the 16th century onward was, among other things, a mass training in interiority, a collective development of the human capacity to inhabit and value the private inner world. And yet, even as this development was happening, the lives of ordinary people remained thoroughly communal by modern standards. The private reading experience was available primarily to those who could read, who had access to books, and who had sufficient leisure and space to pursue it, which meant, for most of the early modern period, a small educated elite. For the great majority of European populations, and for virtually all populations in other parts of the world, life in the 16th and 17th centuries still looked far more like the communal life of the ancient past than the private life of the modern present. People slept in shared beds. They worked in communal spaces. They conducted the most intimate functions of their bodies in proximity to others. The concept of a private sphere, a domain of personal life shielded from collective observation, was, for most people, not a lived experience, but an aspiration at best, and a meaningless abstraction at worst. The truly dramatic change the one that moved private life from the experience of a privileged few to something approaching a general cultural expectation in developed societies, came with industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries. Industrialization produced, among its many consequences, a new relationship between work and home. For most of human history, including most of the agricultural period, work and domestic life were not spatially separated. The farm was where the family lived. The workshop was in the home. The social world of work and the social world of family overlapped extensively and naturally. With industrialization, work moved into factories and offices, and home became a distinct and separate sphere. One that was increasingly defined, especially in the emerging middle-class culture of the 19th century, as a refuge from the public world. The Victorian ideal of the home as a private sanctuary, a place of warmth and domesticity insulated from the impersonal demands of the industrial economy, was the cultural expression of this new spatial reality. This transformation had profound implications for the social meaning of privacy. In the Victorian and Edwardian periods, particularly among the middle and upper classes of industrialized societies, privacy became not just a practice but a moral ideal. The private home was understood as the proper location for the authentic self, the real person behind the public mask. The boundary between the domestic interior and the public world became a charged and carefully maintained distinction. What happened inside the home was considered, in a way that had not been true before, genuinely private, belonging to the family and not to the community or the state. This was the cultural moment in which many of the norms around domestic privacy that we now take for granted, the expectation of privacy in the bedroom, the bathroom, the family's intimate life, were first articulated and institutionalized. And yet this ideal of domestic privacy was always partly a fiction, more available to some than to others, and always in tension with the realities of urban industrial life. The working-class neighbourhoods of 19th century industrial cities were, in practice, extraordinarily communal spaces, where overcrowding, shared facilities, and the close proximity of dense urban living made privacy a practical impossibility for most residents. The tenement buildings of New York, London, and Manchester in the late 19th century, with their shared toilets and communal washrooms and paper-thin walls, reproduce something of the conditions of ancient communal life, not by choice or by cultural preference, but by economic necessity. The ideal of the private home as a sanctuary was an ideal that the industrial working class could aspire to, but rarely achieve. This gap between the ideal and the reality of private life has persisted, in various forms, throughout the modern period. Even as the physical conditions of privacy have become more widely available, as rising standards of living, smaller family sizes, and improved housing have given more people access to genuinely private domestic space. The psychological and social dimensions of privacy have remained contested and unequally distributed. The surveillance capacity of modern states and corporations has, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, introduced new forms of collective observation into the private lives of individuals in ways that raise profound questions about what privacy can mean in a world of pervasive digital monitoring. From an evolutionary perspective, the development of digital surveillance represents something genuinely novel in human experience, not the return to an ancient condition, but the creation of a new one. In the ancient band, collective observation of individual behaviour served a social coordination function, It was performed by people who knew you, who had ongoing relationships with you, who would be affected by your behaviour, and who you could affect in return. It was, in other words, observation embedded in relationship. Digital surveillance is fundamentally different. It is observation without relationship, monitoring without the social context that gives collective observation its ancient meaning and function. It mimics the conditions of the communal past without replicating the social bonds that made those conditions tolerable, and, in many ways, genuinely valuable. This distinction matters because it helps explain why modern surveillance feels like an invasion, in a way that the communal observation of the ancient band did not. The people of a Hadza camp who are aware of each other's food stores, emotional states, and physical condition are not experiencing surveillance in any meaningful sense. They're experiencing membership. They are experiencing the constant reciprocal mutual visibility that comes with belonging to a group in which everyone's welfare is genuinely interdependent. The visibility is not abstract or institutional. It is personal, particular, and embedded in ongoing relationship. To be seen in this context is to be recognized as a person, not merely monitored as a data point. The distinction between being seen and being monitored is one of the most important distinctions in the contemporary politics of privacy. And it is a distinction that evolutionary history helps us understand more clearly, because it reveals that the human discomfort with surveillance is not simply a preference for concealment or a desire to escape accountability. It is a response rooted in a much deeper evolutionary expectation. The expectation that visibility is reciprocal, relational, and embedded in genuine community. The modern surveillance state and the modern data economy violate this expectation not by making us visible. We were always visible in the world in which our psychology was shaped, but by making us visible to entities that are not part of our community, that do not share our interests or our vulnerabilities, and that do not offer in return the belonging and mutual support that ancient communal visibility always entailed. If we try to draw these threads together into a coherent picture, we arrive at something that is both simple and profound. The story of human privacy is the story of a species navigating between two deep evolutionary needs that have always been in tension. The need for belonging, for the warmth and security and meaning that comes from being known and connected to others, and the need for a domain that is one's own, a space in which the interior life can develop and express itself without constant external pressure. For most of our history, the first need was comprehensively met, and the second was not even conceptualized. The long arc of social development over the past 10,000 years has been, in many ways, a process of trying to make room for the second without entirely sacrificing the first. We have not yet found a stable equilibrium. The modern world, with its architecture of solitude, its digital connectivity that promises community, while often delivering only the simulation of it, and its unprecedented degree of physical privacy, coexisting with unprecedented degrees of institutional surveillance, represents a genuinely unprecedented situation in human history. We are trying to balance needs whose relative weight in our psychology was calibrated in a world that no longer exists. The tools we have for thinking about this, the philosophical frameworks around individual rights and the public good, the legal structures of privacy law, the social norms around personal disclosure and collective observation, are all relatively recent inventions, historically speaking. They are works in progress, built by and for a kind of social life that is still very new. And yet the body remembers older things. The relief of genuine company, the particular quality of warmth that comes from being truly known by others, the sense of safety that accompanies the feeling of belonging. These are not recent cultural acquisitions. They are ancient biological inheritances, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of life in close and constant community. They speak in the language of the nervous system, not the language of philosophy. They are yes, even in a world that has provided us with more private space than any previous generation of humans has known. We so often still feel most fully ourselves in the company of others who see us clearly and remain. The night that an early human band made camp on the open savannah, perhaps 200,000 years ago, and the bodies settled together near the fire, and the sounds of sleep rose and fell in the shared darkness. That night was not a night of deprivation. It was a night of what our species spent almost all of its existence surrounded by, each other, close enough to touch, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to know that the darkness held no solitary terrors because no one was alone in it. We have come a long way from that fire, and in the quiet of the night, alone in rooms our ancestors could not have imagined, we carry that fire's memory in ourselves. The longing for it is not weakness. It is not failure. It is the oldest thing about us, asking in its slow and wordless way to be acknowledged, to be understood not as a problem to be solved, but as an inheritance to be honoured, a reminder of the kind of creature we are and the kind of belonging we were shaped over the long dark years to need. And so we can rest now in that understanding, not with answers, but with a quieter sense of the question. The walls around us are new, the silence in them is new, the self that inhabits them, private, interior, its own, is new. But underneath that new self, underneath the architecture and the philosophy and the long, slow history of privacy's emergence, there is something much older, something that knows, in the way only very old things know, what it means to sleep in the warmth of others, what it means to be known, what it means to belong without remainder to a world that holds you and is held by you in return. That older thing is not gone. It is resting. And in the slow drift towards sleep, in the relaxation of the careful social self we maintain through the waking hours, it stirs gently and remembers. But there is more to say about the journey between that ancient fire and this quiet moment. There are more layers to peel back, more angles from which to approach the question of what it cost and what it gave us. This long, slow experiment in separation. And because the mind at rest is the mind most open to the long view, let us continue for a while longer. Let us trace a few more threads of this extraordinary story before the night fully settles. One of the threads worth following is the thread of language itself, because the development of spoken language, which most researchers now believe was substantially in place in Homo sapiens by at least 100,000 years ago, though the precise timeline remains a matter of scholarly debate, was perhaps the single most important factor in shaping the particular quality of the communal life our ancestors lived. Language did not simply make communication more efficient. It transformed the nature of social life in ways that had profound implications for the experience of privacy and its absence. To understand this, it helps to think carefully about what language actually does in a social group. Before language, or in species, with only very limited communicative capacity, social coordination is largely achieved through direct observation and imitation. You watch what others do, and you do likewise. You respond to the immediate emotional signals of those around you, their posture, their vocalizations, their facial expressions, and you adjust your own behavior accordingly. This kind of social coordination is real and effective, but it is fundamentally local. It operates in the present, in the space of direct sensory contact. It cannot easily transmit information about things that are not present, events that happen in the past, plans for the future, or the internal states of individuals who are not currently visible. Language changes all of this. With language, the range of what can be communicated expands almost without limit. You can describe a place you visited yesterday and share its characteristics with someone who was not there. You can report what another person said or did in your absence. You can plan a coordinated activity that will take place tomorrow. You can express your inner states, your fears, your desires, your assessments of other people's behavior in ways that make them available to others as objects of shared contemplation. Language, in short, radically extends the reach of collective observation. It makes the group aware not just of what is directly visible, but of what has been seen, heard, reported, remembered, and interpreted. In the context of a small forager band, this extended reach of language meant that very little about anyone's life remained effectively private. Even actions taken in relative physical isolation, a solitary excursion, a private conversation between two individuals, could be known to the wider group through the mechanism of speech. Not only what you did, but what you said, what you were seen doing, what others thought of your behaviour. All of this circulated through the group via language, its continuous flow of social information. Anthropologists who study gossip in contemporary forager societies have found that it serves an important social regulation function. It keeps the group informed about the behaviour of its members, allows collective judgments to be formed and expressed, and enforces social norms through the mild but continuous pressure of reputational consequence. The researcher Robin Dunbar, whose work on the social brain hypothesis has already been mentioned, has argued that human language evolved in significant part as a mechanism for social bonding and information sharing, a kind of vocal grooming that replaced the physical grooming practiced by other primates and allowed much larger groups to maintain social cohesion. If Dunbar's hypothesis is correct, it means that the very faculty that we most associate with our inner life, language, thought, the interior monologue of the reflective mind, evolved primarily as a social tool. The voice that speaks inside your head was shaped over millions of years to speak to others. The interior life that language enables is, at its evolutionary origin, a social product. This is a remarkable inversion of the way we usually think about language and thought. We tend to imagine thought as primary and language as the tool through which thought is expressed externally. But the evolutionary story suggests something more complex and more interesting, that the capacity for language and the capacity for complex thought co-evolved, and that both were shaped primarily by the demands of social life rather than by the demands of solitary reflection. The mind, in this view, is fundamentally a social organ, shaped by and for life in community, capable of extraordinary interior complexity, but rooted in the same communal world that defined our ancestors' existence. This has implications for how we think about the relationship between privacy and thought. The modern intuition is that genuine thinking requires privacy, that the distractions and demands of social life interrupt and degrade the quality of mental activity. And there is truth in this. particularly for certain kinds of sustained, focused, technical thought, but it is not the whole truth. The kind of thinking that emerges from conversation, from the friction of encountering other perspectives, from the challenge of articulating one's ideas to an audience that may not share one's assumptions. This kind of thinking is in many ways more generative and more correcting than the thinking done in isolation. The history of philosophy is, among other things, a history of conversation, of ideas sharpened and refined through dialogue. The Socratic method, the scholastic disputatio, the scientific conference, the editorial exchange between writer and reader. All of these are practices that recognize and institutionalize the social roots of thought. If we look deeper at what this suggests about the ancient communal world, we find that the absence of privacy was not simply a deprivation of the conditions for good thinking. It was, in its own way, a provision of something equally important, the constant social stimulus that kept the mind engaged, challenged and connected to a shared reality. The man who sat at the edge of the camp watching the fire while the rest of the group slept was not merely guarding against predators, he was also thinking in the way that human minds think, which is to say in a stream of language, memory, anticipation, and feeling that drew on everything he had heard and seen and felt in the company of others. His interior world was built from communal materials. His solitude, such as it was not an escape from the social world, but a temporary variation in its texture. There is a quality of attention that seems to develop in conditions of forced togetherness that is worth considering. In a world without private space, without the ability to withdraw from others, the only available form of psychological space is interior attention, the capacity to be present in a shared environment, while also maintaining a contiguous thread of one's own experience and reflection. This is a skill that requires practice, and one that the conditions of communal life forced our ancestors to develop and refine over hundreds of thousands of years. The meditator's ability to be still and attentive in the midst of activity, the musician's ability to hear their own instrument within the complexity of an ensemble, the elder's ability to sit quietly in the center of a busy camp and maintain the long perspective. All of these might be understood as expressions of a form of interior privacy that does not require physical separation. The private self, in this view, was not created by walls. It was created by the discipline of attention cultivated in a world that offered no walls at all. This is a thought worth holding gently as we consider what the ancient communal world might have been like from the inside. We tend to project onto it either a kind of warm, uncomplicated togetherness, a vision of the happy tribe, or a vision of oppressive, inescapable social pressure. Neither extreme is likely to be accurate. The reality was, as human reality always is, more textured and more interesting than either projection. There was genuine warmth in the communal life, genuine security, genuine belonging. There was also genuine social pressure, genuine limitation, genuine difficulty in being seen and known in ways that could not be avoided or managed. And within that world, individual human beings found ways to maintain a sense of their own interiority, their own experience, their own private thread of selfhood, not through physical separation, but through the cultivation of a kind of interior distance that left no archaeological trace but was, almost certainly, as real and as important as the stone tools and the fire and the shared food. The evidence from contemporary foraging societies supports this view. Among the Hadza and the San, despite the extraordinary degree of social visibility and communal life, individuals maintain a clear sense of their own perspective, their own preferences, their own interior world. They have opinions they do not share. They have feelings they do not always express. They have a sense of their own distinctness within the collective that is not simply a modern projection, but an observable feature of their social interaction. Privacy in this light is not primarily a matter of physical separation. It is primarily a matter of the recognition that each individual has an interior life that is their own, a recognition that may be expressed through physical space when physical space is available, but that exists independently of it. What changed with the development of private space was not the existence of the interior life, but its social recognition and cultural elaboration. When architecture began to make physical privacy possible, the interior life that had always existed became, for the first time, something that could be cultivated in solitude and expressed in forms, written language, visual art, music composed for a private contemplation, that were specifically adapted to individual interior experience. The room of one's own did not create the self, but it did give the self a new kind of room to move in, a new kind of light to develop in, and a new kind of language to speak in. And that expansion of the self's territory, for all the loneliness it sometimes brings, has been one of the most significant developments in the long history of human experience. To understand the scope of this development, it helps to consider what kinds of inner experience are facilitated by private space that are either absent or much more attenuated in the communal world. One of the most significant is the experience of solitary grief. In communal life, grief is necessarily social. When a member of the band dies, the grief is shared, is expressed and witnessed collectively. Rituals of mourning are communal events. The bereaved are not left alone with their loss, but neither are they given the space to process grief in the private, individualized way that has become the norm in contemporary Western cultures. The slow, solitary working through of loss that takes place in private rooms, in private journals, in private conversations with therapists or close friends. The communal grief of the ancient world was immediate, embodied, and collectively held. The private grief of the modern world is often delayed, intellectualized, and individually carried. Both have their costs and their gifts, but they are genuinely different experiences, and the difference between them tells us something important about what private space changes in human emotional life. Similarly, the experience of solitary joy, the joy of reading a novel alone, of sitting in a garden in the early morning, of walking without company through a landscape that feels entirely one's own in that moment, is a distinctly private experience that the communal world of the forest should only partially approximate. There are moments in communal life that approach this quality. The experience of flow in a skilled task, the meditative absorption of certain kinds of repetitive work, the particular quality of attention that opens in the hours of night, watch when the rest of the camp is asleep, but the fully elaborated experience of private joy, the joy of the interior life fully inhabited and perfectly one's own, is something that private space makes possible in a new and distinctive way. It is worth pausing here to consider what these different emotional textures tell us about the relationship between privacy and human flourishing. The field of positive psychology, which has studied the conditions for human well-being extensively over the past several decades, has found consistent evidence that both social connection and private reflection are important contributors to a flourishing life. People who have rich social connections and who also have adequate private time for reflection and self-development tend to report higher levels of well-being than those who lack either. The research suggests, in other words, that the human need for belonging and the human need for privacy are not simply opposites in tension with each other. They are complementary aspects of a full human life, each enriching the other when both are adequately met. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Our ancestors needed the social connection to survive and thrive in a physical and social sense. They needed the interior tension, the quiet inner thread of self-awareness and reflection, to navigate the complex social world they inhabited and to develop the individual capacities that they contributed to the group. These two dimensions of experience were always present together, even in the world without walls. What changed over the millennia was not the need for both, but the infrastructure available to serve each need. Private space gave the interior life new room to grow. Community gave the social self new forms of connection to sustain it. The challenge of modern life is to maintain both in a world that has become very good at providing physical privacy and considerably less reliable at providing genuine community. There's a particular quality of loneliness that seems specific to the modern world. A loneliness that is not simply the absence of others, but the presence of others who do not truly know you. In a world where social interaction is often mediated by professional roles, digital interfaces, and the careful management of personal disclosure, many people find themselves surrounded by acquaintances and colleagues while experiencing a deep deficit of the kind of knowing that forager life provided as a matter of course. To be known in the way that a small band knows its members, your habits, your history, your struggles, your particular way of moving through the world, is a form of recognition that goes beyond information. It is a form of belonging that the human nervous system seems to register as fundamentally different from the more superficial forms of social contact that constitute much of modern social life. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote about the importance of what she called attention, a quality of genuine, patient, receptive awareness of another person that she considered the highest form of human love. This kind of attention, she argued, was not about projecting your own experience onto another or offering your own wisdom and solutions. It was about genuinely, quietly receiving what the other person's reality actually is. This quality of attention was, in the ancient communal world, not a spiritual achievement, but a practical necessity. You paid attention to the people around you because your survival depended on knowing them accurately. Their moods, their capacities, their intentions, their needs. The intimacy of forager life was not simply warm. It was in this sense a form of sustained mutual attention that went deeper in many ways than the attenuated social contact of modern life. There is something in this that helps explain one of the paradoxes of the contemporary moment, the fact that we live in a world more densely connected through technology than any previous human population, and yet we experience rates of loneliness and social isolation that public health researchers now describe as epidemic. The connection provided by digital technology is real in some ways and attenuated in others. It provides information about others without necessarily providing knowledge of them. It allows communication without necessarily providing the embodied sensory richness of physical presence. It enables broad social networks without necessarily providing the deep mutual knowing of small, stable, face-to-face communities. In short, it provides a form of togetherness that satisfies some of what the ancient communal world provided, but falls short in ways that correspond to the deepest evolutionary roots of our social needs. This is not an argument against technology. It is an observation about what technology can and cannot replace. What dimensions of social life are preserved in digital form, and what dimensions are lost in translation. The ancient communal world offered physical warmth, embodied presence, the sensory richness of shared daily life, the smell of the fire, the sound of breathing in the night, the touch of a hand in darkness, the sight of a face responding in real time to what you're saying and feeling. These are not trivial extras. They are, from an evolutionary perspective, the primary medium through which human social bonds were formed and sustained over hundreds of thousands of years. Their partial absence in the digitally mediated social life of the contemporary world is not a minor inconvenience. It is a significant gap between what our biology expects and what our environment provides, and yet we adapt. The human capacity for adaptation is one of the most remarkable features of our species. Homo sapiens has occupied every major terrestrial environment on Earth, has sustained itself on diets ranging from almost exclusively marine mammals to almost exclusively plant foods, has organised its social life in forms ranging from tiny nomadic bands to cities of tens of millions, has developed technologies that have changed the physical parameters of existence more rapidly than any previous species in the history of life on Earth. This extraordinary adaptability is itself a product of evolutionary history, the result of a long process of natural selection that favoured not specialised adaptation to particular conditions, but the general cognitive flexibility to navigate a wide range of conditions. Our current situation, this experiment in private life, in digital connection, in the management of social need through a combination of our intimate domestic spaces and vast impersonal urban landscapes, is not something we evolved for, but it is something we are, with varying degrees of success, adapting to. The process of that adaptation is visible in the cultural changes of recent decades. The rise of intentional communities and communal living arrangements among people who have chosen to prioritise the social dimensions of life over the private ones. The growing interest in meditation and contemplative practices that cultivate the interior attention that private space no longer automatically provides. The extraordinary popular appetite for fiction that provides the experience of deep knowing of other people's inner lives. The persistent human tendency to create community wherever people gather, in workplaces, in online forums, in neighbourhood associations, in the informal social world of cafes and parks and communal spaces. These are all, in their different ways, attempts to navigate the tension between the private life that modern architecture and culture have built, and the communal life that our evolutionary history has prepared us for. They are experiments in balance, ongoing, imperfect, genuinely creative attempts to honour both the need for belonging and the need for a life that is one's own. They deserve to be understood not as failures of modernity, but as expressions of very old and very deep human wisdom. The wisdom that knows, even when the walls are solid and the door is closed and the night is quiet, that we did not arrive here alone, and that the self inhabiting this private room was made, in every important sense, by others. From an evolutionary perspective, the most honest thing we can say about privacy is this: it is neither natural nor unnatural to the human species. It is something we developed the capacity for, something our cognitive flexibility eventually allowed us to build and value and elaborate into philosophy and law and architecture, and the inward turn of the examined life, but it is built on a foundation, biological, psychological, social, that was shaped entirely by the experience of the communal world. The private self is the communal self turned inward, examining what the communal world made. The interior life is the social life's deepest room. In early human environments, as the fire burned low and the camp settled into sleep, the boundary between self and other was thinner than we can easily imagine today. The sounds of others' dreaming were woven into one's own. The warmth of other bodies was an extension of one's own warmth. The shared breath of the sleeping group rose and fell in a rhythm that held everyone together in a kind of biological communion that we have no good word for in modern language. It was not the loss of self. It was the self, in its original and most ancient condition, porous, relational, embedded, whole. We have built walls around that self since then. The walls are real. They have given us genuine gifts. The room to think, the space to feel, the freedom to be different, the protection of the individual from the full weight of collective demand. We would not give them up, and we should not romanticize a world without them. But neither should we forget what is on the other side of the wall. The long human past, the vast dark stretch of time before privacy existed, is not simply a period of deprivation that we have gratefully left behind. It is the period in which we were shaped for belonging, for mutual knowing, for the particular warmth of the life shared completely, held together by necessity and made meaningful by love. That shaping does not disappear when we close the door. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the deep biological hunger for connection that no amount of private space can entirely satisfy. It speaks in the middle of the night when the room is very quiet and the darkness is complete. It speaks in the relief we feel when someone truly sees us. It speaks in the way the body relaxes deeply and completely in the presence of someone who knows us well enough that we do not have to explain ourselves. And so we arrive at last at a place of rest, not at a conclusion. The questions raised by the long history of human privacy are too large and too alive for conclusions. But at a quieter relationship with the questions, we can lie down in the dark with the awareness that we are part of a story that began long before us, in open savanna and shared fire and the constant warmth of others nearby. That story is still going on. We are still writing it every time we choose connection over isolation, every time we allow ourselves to be truly known, every time we extend genuine attention to another person and receive it in return. The walls are ours. The night is shared as it has always been. And somewhere beneath the silence of this private room, if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear the breathing of the ancient camp. Steady, low, unhurried, going on and on in the dark, holding everyone who has ever lived inside its rhythm, now and long ago, and in the deep time that stretches back before memory, before language, before the first fire, to the very beginning of what it means to be human together. Rest now. The story has been told, the fire is low, and you are not in any way that matters alone. And yet, because the mind at the edge of sleep is sometimes most alive to the slow drift of history, there is still a little more to say. There are still a few quiet corridors of this subject that are worth moving through before the narrative fully closes. Because the story of privacy is also, in the end, a story about the nature of trust. And trust is one of the oldest and most essential things that human beings have ever built together. In the communal world of the ancestral band, trust was not an abstraction. It was not a philosophical concept or a legal principle. It was a lived, daily embodied reality. The accumulated experience of knowing that the people around you would share their food when you were hungry, would watch over you when you were sick, would defend you when you were threatened, would tell you the truth about what they saw and heard and felt. Trust in this context was as practical as fire. It was one of the primary mechanisms by which a group of biologically vulnerable animals managed to survive in environments that would otherwise have been fatal to individuals operating alone, and it depended fundamentally on the transparency that communal life enforced. When everything was visible, when everyone knew what everyone else had and did and said, the conditions for a particular kind of deep functional trust were in place. Not a trust based on idealism or naive faith, but a trust based on accumulated evidence. The daily repeated demonstration that the people around you were reliable, that their behaviour matched their words, that what you saw was what was real. This is an important insight because it reveals something counterintuitive about the relationship between privacy and trust. In contemporary culture, privacy and trust are often discussed as complementary. We trust people enough to share private information with them, and that sharing builds trust. The private disclosure is the gift, the trust is the response. But in the ancient communal world, the relationship was almost the reverse. The absence of privacy was itself the foundation of trust. When nothing was hidden, when the entire life of every member of the group was available for collective observation, the question of trustworthiness was answered not through disclosure, but through demonstrated behaviour, day after day in full view of everyone. The transparency was not chosen, it was structural, and it produced a kind of trust that was correspondingly structural, not dependent on any individual act of disclosure, but woven into the fabric of shared daily life. This does not mean that forager societies were free of deception or betrayal. They were not. The anthropological and primatological evidence suggests that the capacity for strategic deception, for presenting a false impression of one's intentions or actions to others, is extremely old in primates, long predating Homo sapiens and almost certainly present in our ancestral populations. But the communal transparency of band life made sustained deception extraordinarily difficult. If every action is potentially visible to multiple observers, if information flows freely through a dense social network of people who know each other intimately, the opportunities for maintaining a false impression over time are severely limited. The social world of the forager was, in this sense, a world with a very low tolerance for the kind of sustained dishonesty that private life makes possible. The philosopher Erving Goffman wrote extensively about the way in which private and public life involve what he called front stage and backstage performances, the managed, carefully curated presentation of self that people offer in public contexts, and the more relaxed, less carefully managed self that appears when the audience withdraws. In Goffman's framework, private space is the backstage, the place where the masks come off, where the social performance is allowed to lapse, where the self can be something other than what it presents to the world. This is one of the most valuable things about private space. It allows a kind of authenticity and rest that sustained social performance does not permit. But it also creates the possibility of a gap between the front stage and backstage self that can become, in extreme cases, the gap between who one appears to be and who one actually is. In the ancient communal world, where backstage was either very limited or essentially non-existent, this particular form of inauthenticity was much harder to sustain. The self that appeared in public and the self that existed in private were, of necessity, very close to each other. This is both a constraint and a liberation. It is a constraint because it leaves little room for the management of personal presentation, for the protection of the vulnerable and unfinished parts of the self from public scrutiny. But it is a liberation in the sense that it removes the burden of maintaining a gap between who you appear to be and who you are, a burden that, as any honest examination of modern social life reveals, can be extraordinarily heavy. The weight of managing one's public self, of maintaining consistent personal branding across multiple social contexts, of carefully calibrating what to reveal and what to conceal, of presenting an acceptable face to employers and neighbours and acquaintances while managing a very different inner reality, is one of the characteristic burdens of contemporary social life. It is a burden that did not exist, at least not in anything like its current form, in the world of the small forager band. And while we would not give up the freedom and dignity that private space provides, it is worth acknowledging that the management of the gap between public and private self is genuinely costly, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. Some of the most compelling research in social psychology over recent decades has been concerned with the consequences of this gap. Studies on what researchers call self-disclosure, the process of revealing personal information to others, have found consistently that genuine self-disclosure, the sharing of real inner experience with people who respond with empathy and understanding, is one of the most reliable routes to psychological well-being and the deepening of social bonds. This finding seems paradoxical in a world that values privacy so highly. If privacy is so important, why does sharing so consistently make us feel better? The evolutionary answer is that disclosure is, in a fundamental sense, the direction our social biology points us in. The drive to be known, to be seen accurately, to have our inner experience witnessed and validated by others, is not a weakness or a vulnerability, but one of the deepest expressions of our nature as social animals. We evolved in conditions where being known was not a risk but a necessity. The protective concealment that privacy makes possible is genuinely valuable, but it runs against a very deep current in our evolutionary inheritance. This is one of the reasons why confession, in its various cultural forms, has been such a persistent and widespread human practice. Across enormously different cultural contexts, the Catholic confessional, the practice of public self-criticism in some East Asian cultural traditions, the group therapy session, the 12-step meeting, the confessional blog post, the intimate conversation with a trusted friend. Human beings have consistently sought contexts in which the private self can be made visible and received without condemnation. The relief associated with genuine confession is not merely the relief of guilt discharge, though it is that. It is the relief of the gap between public and private self being momentarily closed, of the backstage self being allowed into the light and finding that it can survive there, that it is not destroyed by being known. In the ancient communal world, this particular form of relief was not available in the same way, because the gap itself was much smaller. What was available instead was something that we might call the relief of unself-conscious belonging, the ease of a self that does not need to manage its presentation because the context of belonging is already established, already unconditional, already built into the structure of daily life. The person who has lived in the same band for their entire life, who's been known by the same people since birth, who has no backstage because the front and back of their life are the same continuous visible reality. That person does not need confession in the way that the person with a rich and carefully maintained private life may need it. The need for confession is, in part, a consequence of the gap that privacy creates. None of this is to suggest that the ancient world was psychologically simpler or less demanding than the modern one. The social pressures of communal life, the constant awareness of being observed, the weight of collective expectation, the difficulty of being different in a world where difference carried real social cost, were genuinely demanding in their own ways. The individual who did not conform to the group's expectations, whose temperament or desires or capacities did not fit the available social roles, faced the full weight of collective pressure without the refuge of private space in which to be quietly and safely themselves. The introverted person, the unconventionally skilled person, the person whose emotional world didn't match the social norm, such individuals existed in the ancient communal world, as they have always existed in every human society, and their experience of life in that world was not uniformly comfortable or easy. The development of private space in this light was not just a change in the physical organization of human life, it was the creation of a new kind of refuge, a place where the self that did not fit could exist without constant negotiation with the collective. The room of one's own was not only a space for creative or intellectual work, it was space for the part of the self that was too strange, too tender, too different, too fragile to be fully exposed to the communal gaze. In this sense, privacy was not only a luxury or a philosophical ideal. For many people, it was a survival strategy. The means by which a self that could not fully meet the demands of the social world could nevertheless exist, develop, and find its own forms of meaning and expression. The history of art is, in many ways, the history of this survival. The poet writing alone by candlelight, the painter in the studio, the composer at the keyboard in the early hours. These are figures who required the conditions of private space to produce work that, paradoxically, spoke to something universal in human experience. The interior worlds explored in the greatest literature, the emotional and psychological depths that the novel has made available to millions of readers, are worlds that could not have been accessed or expressed without the conditions of private life. The expansion of private space over the past several centuries has been one of the preconditions for the extraordinary flowering of interior-focused art and literature that has been one of the great achievements of modern culture. And yet that art has also consistently sought to bridge the gap between private and communal, to take what was found in the interior and bring it back into shared life, to use the privacy of the creative process to produce something that others could recognize and respond to. The greatest literature does not celebrate solitude. It explores the interior life in order to make it available to others, to say, here is what it feels like to be human from the inside, to create the conditions for a recognition that is, in its own way, a form of the ancient communal knowing. The novel reader, alone with a book, is participating in an act of imaginative community, entering into the interior world of characters whose experience resonates with their own, feeling less alone because they are being seen, even in fiction, even in the solitude of reading, even across the vast distance of time and culture that may separate them from the author's world. This is one of the most beautiful things about the particular form of privacy that reading and writing enable. It is privacy that reaches toward community. solitude that produces connection, interiority that makes itself available to others. It is, in this sense, a kind of resolution of the ancient tension between the private and the communal. Not a final resolution. The tension does not dissolve. It only finds, in the act of literary creation and reception, a particularly rich and sustainable form. But a resolution nonetheless, in the sense of a harmony that contains both notes without requiring either to be silenced. If we look across the full span of human history with this tension in mind, the tension between belonging and privacy, between communal life and the interior self, what we see is not a simple story of progress from one to the other. We see instead a story of constant negotiation, constant adjustment, constant searching for forms of social life that can honour both dimensions of what it means to be human. Different cultures in different times and places have found different points of balance along this spectrum. Some have emphasized the communal at the expense of the individual. Others have emphasized the individual at the expense of the communal. Most have found some intermediate position that shifts over time in response to changing conditions and evolving values. The contemporary moment is not the end of this story. It is a particular chapter of it, one defined by extraordinary physical privacy and extraordinary digital connectivity, by an unprecedented degree of individual isolation, coexisting with an unprecedented degree of technological interconnection. The paradoxes of this chapter are genuine and challenging, but they are not unprecedented in their underlying structure. Every generation of human beings has faced its own version of the question of how to balance the need for belonging with the need for a life that is genuinely one's own. Every generation has improvised its own answers, built its own forms of community and its own spaces of refuge, found its own balance points along the ancient spectrum. Our generation will do the same. The improvisation is already underway. In the housing communities that are reviving some of the special conditions of communal life within the framework of modern private ownership. In the neighbourhood initiatives that are rebuilding local community across the anonymity of urban life. In the therapeutic and spiritual practices that are cultivating interior attention in a world of external distraction. In the forms of art and storytelling and shared experience that are creating, however imperfectly, the conditions for genuine mutual knowing in a world that has more walls than fires. And underneath all of it, shaping all of it, informing all of it in ways that are often invisible but always real, is the long history we have been tracing tonight. The 200,000 years of communal life, the 10,000 years of agricultural settlement, the centuries of slowly elaborating private space, the decades of digital connection, all of it is part of the same continuous story of a social species navigating the world it lives in and the world it carries inside it. We're all, in this sense, living at the intersection of evolutionary time and historical time, shaped by one, navigating the other, treeing always to find the forms of life that allow both the belonging and the interiority, both the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the room to coexist. That navigation never fully resolves. It was not resolved in the ancient world, where the communal life was rich but the interior self had limited room to develop. It was not resolved in the centuries of emerging private life, where the interior self found new room, but the communal warmth was progressively harder to sustain. It is not resolved now, in this strange moment of maximum private space and minimum genuine community. It may never be fully resolved, because the tension at its heart is not a problem to be solved but a condition of being human. the condition of being a creature who is both irreducibly individual and irreducibly social, both an interior world unto itself and a node in a web of relationship that extends far beyond any individual lifetime. The best we can do, and it is not nothing, is to hold both sides of this truth clearly and without flinching, to value the private room and to miss the ancient fire, to protect the interior life and to seek the communal warmth, to understand that solitude is sometimes the truest expression of our humanity, and that at other times humanity is only truly itself in the presence of others. To know, in some deep and inarticulate way, that the walls and the fire belong to this same story, that the room we sleep in tonight was, in some sense, always there inside the camp, waiting to be built, and that the camp was always there inside the room, waiting to be remembered. The fire is very low now. The camp is quiet. The long history of the human animal, with all its communal warmth and all its gradual, painful, beautiful discovery of interiority, settles into the night like smoke rising and dispersing into dark air. It does not disappear. It only changes form. It becomes the quiet inside us, the interior that is built from community, that carries community within it, that is, in its deepest nature, never truly alone. Sleep well. The ancient camp is still here, in the rhythm of your breathing, the warmth of the room, in the long and quiet continuity of what it means to be human in the dark. Rest now. The story has been told. The fire is low, and you are not in any way that matters alone. But before the last ember fades, there is one more thread to follow. It is a thread that runs through the biological rather than the cultural, through the body rather than the mind, and it concerns something that we do every night without thinking about it, something that was shaped by millions of years of communal life, and that still carries the marks of that shaping in ways that modern science is only beginning to understand. It concerns the biology of sleep itself. Human sleep is unusual among mammals in several respects, but one of the most interesting is the way in which its architecture appears to have been shaped by the conditions of group living. The human sleep cycle, with its characteristic alternation between periods of deep, non-EM sleep and lighter, dream-rich REM sleep, repeats itself several times through the night in a pattern that most sleep researchers believe evolved in response to the demands of life in small, socially interdependent groups. The lighter phases of sleep, during which the sleeper is more easily aroused, may have served as natural monitoring points, moments in the cycle when the sleeping individual could briefly and partially assess the environment for danger before descending again into deeper rest. In a world where predators were real and the group's safety depended on at least partial vigilance through the night, a sleep architecture that included regular transitions through lighter, more alert states would have conferred survival advantages. This is one reason why many people naturally wake briefly during the night, often in the early hours of the morning, before returning to sleep. For centuries, this pattern, known historically as Biphasic sleep, was described in European documents as a normal feature of nightly rest. People should sleep for several hours, wake for a period of an hour or two, and then sleep again until morning. The historian Roger Kirsch, who has researched the history of sleep extensively, found hundreds of references in pre-industrial European texts to this first and second sleep, to the period of wakefulness between them as a time for prayer, reflection, conversation with a bed partner, or simply quiet wakefulness. With the introduction of artificial lighting in the 19th century and the hardening of the expectation of a single, consolidated 8-hour sleep, this natural biphasic rhythm was largely suppressed in industrial societies, but the underlying biology may still be present, expressing itself as the middle-of-the-night wakefulness that many people experience and that, in contemporary culture, is often misdiagnosed as insomnia. The relevance of this to our larger story is the communal dimension of sleep in the ancestral world. In a band sleeping together in a shared space, different individuals would be cycling through different sleep stages at different times, which meant that at any given moment through the night, at least some members of the group were in lighter, more alert phases of sleep. This created a kind of distributed, unconscious vigilance, a communal monitoring of the sleeping environment that required no single individual to sacrifice their sleep to keep watch. The group, simply by sleeping together and cycling through sleep stages at slightly different times, provided its own security. The warmth of bodies together regulated body temperature and reduced the metabolic cost of staying warm through the night. The sounds of others sleeping, breathing, these small movements of dreaming bodies, provided the low-level sensory assurance that the group was intact, that nothing had disturbed the camp, that the night was proceeding without alarm. Sleep researchers studying contemporary hunter-gatherer populations have found evidence for this kind of communal sleep architecture in the Hadza of Tanzania. A study led by Jerome Siegel of the University of California found that Hadza sleep patterns showed significant variation among individuals, with some members of the group being more alert while others were in deeper sleep, in a way that ensured some degree of group vigilance was maintained throughout the night, even without formal watch assignments. The researchers described this as a kind of natural sentinel system, an emergent property of group sleep that provided collective security without any individual bearing the full cost of wakefulness. This finding has a poignant implication for the understanding of modern sleep difficulties. Many people who live alone or who sleep in conditions of complete physical isolation report difficulty sleeping, a subtle but persistent sense of vulnerability or arousal that prevents the full relaxation that deep sleep requires. Sleep researchers have found that the presence of a sleeping partner, even in the absence of any direct physical contact, can improve sleep quality in measurable ways, reducing the time it takes to fall asleep, increasing the proportion of time spent in deep sleep stages, and reducing the frequency of nighttime wakefulness. The body, it seems, is calibrated for communal sleep in ways that affect its ability to rest fully in isolation. The ancient expectation of others nearby is written into the biology of sleep in ways that solitary sleepers still experience as low-level, often unnamed, sense of incompleteness. This is one of the most direct and physiological ways in which the absence of the communal life our ancestors knew expresses itself in the bodies of modern people. We sleep alone, and our bodies know it, not consciously, not in any way that produces articulate awareness, but in the subtle architecture of arousal and relaxation that determines the quality of our rest. The feeling of safety that ancient humans derived from sleeping in the warmth of their group is not something we have simply outgrown. It is something our nervous systems still expect, still search for in the darkness, still register as partially missing when it's not there. This biological reality has not been lost on the architects and designers who have thought carefully about the relationship between space and well-being. The growing interest in co-housing communities, in shared living arrangements, in residential designs that build in shared common spaces and facilitate regular communal interaction. These are, in part, responses to the accumulated evidence that human beings do not thrive in conditions of pure physical isolation. The most thoughtful of these designs try to honour both dimensions of human need. Genuinely private spaces that protect individual and family life, combined with shared spaces and social structures that provide something of the communal warmth that pure private housing cannot. The Danish co-housing movement, which began in the 1960s and has since spread across Northern Europe and beyond, offers an instructive example. In a typical co-housing community, residents live in individual dwelling units that provide genuine domestic privacy. Their own kitchen, their own bedroom, their own living space. But these private units are oriented round and connected to a common house, where residents share meals several times a week, where children play together under collective supervision, where the social life of the community is conducted. The design is an attempt to recapture something of the communal dimension of ancient band life, within the framework of modern private ownership and individual domestic autonomy. It is, in its quiet way, an evolutionary experiment, an attempt to find a spatial form that honours the full range of human social need. What is striking about the research on co-housing communities is that residents consistently report high levels of both social satisfaction and privacy satisfaction, which suggests that the communal and private dimensions of the design are not in competition but are genuinely complementary. The shared meals and communal activities provide the sense of belonging and mutual knowing that private domestic life cannot generate on its own. The private units provide the space for solitude, for the interior life, for the rest, from social performance that communal life can make difficult to achieve. The balance between the two is not perfect. No social form perfectly honours the full complexity of human need, but it points in a direction that feels, from an evolutionary perspective, significantly more aligned with our biology than either pure private housing or forced communal living. This kind of thoughtful design of social space is, in a broad sense, one of the things that human intelligence allows us to do that no other animal can. To look at these conditions of our own lives, to understand something of how those conditions came to be and what needs they do and do not serve, and to deliberately design different conditions that might serve our needs better. This is not something our ancestors could do in any systematic way. The conditions of their lives were given by the environment, by the demand of survival, by the social structures that emerged from millions of years of evolutionary pressure. They could adapt to those conditions with extraordinary flexibility, but they could not step back from them and redesign them from the perspective of what would best serve human flourishing. That capacity, the capacity for reflective, deliberate social design, is something that has emerged from the very historical processes we've been tracing, from the development of settled life, of literacy, of complex social institutions, of the intellectual traditions that have slowly accumulated enough understanding of human nature to make genuine design possible. We are, in a real sense, only at the very beginning of using this capacity well. The design of social life in ways that genuinely honour the full range of human need. The need for belonging and the need for privacy, the need for community and the need for individual development, the need for the warmth of the ancient fire, and the need for the quiet of the private room, is a project that is still in its early stages. We've built extraordinary cities that provide physical privacy at a scale never before achieved in human history. but that often fail to provide genuine community. We have built digital networks that connect billions of people, but that often fail to provide the depth of mutual knowing that genuine community requires. We are learning slowly and imperfectly what the long history of our species tells us about what human beings need from their social environments, and we're beginning, in places and in ways that are still marginal but are growing, to design environments that respond to those needs more thoughtfully. This learning is not finished, and may never be finished, because human needs themselves evolve as conditions change, and because the balance between competing needs is not a fixed point, but a moving target, different for different people in different circumstances at different moments in their lives. But the learning is real, and it is grounded in something that goes very deep, in the recognition that we are not simply individuals making choices in isolation, but members of a species with a long and specific evolutionary history that has shaped us for a particular kind of social life. And that understanding that history is one of the most important things we can do to navigate the very different social conditions of the world we now inhabit. The story of human privacy is the story of this navigation of the long, slow journey from the ancient fire to the private room, and of everything that was lost and gained along the way. It is a story that is still being written in the design of cities and the architecture of homes and the structure of digital networks and the practices of communities that are trying to find new forms of the old belonging. It is a story that each of us participates in the choices we make about how to live, how to connect, how to balance the need for solitude and the need for company, how to honour the interior life without abandoning the communal one. And it is a story that is, in its deepest dimension, not really about privacy at all. It is about what it means to be human, to be a social animal with an interior life, a creature that needs both to belong and to be itself, a species that carries the ancient fire in its cells and builds walls around it with its hands. It is about the extraordinary fact that we are here at all, that 200,000 years of communal life, of shared fires and shared food and shared darkness, produced creatures capable of sitting alone in a quiet room and asking, with genuine wonder and genuine humility, what it all means. What it means, perhaps, is this: that the walls we live behind are not a departure from our nature, but an expression of it. That the private self is as human as the communal self, because it grew from the communal self and continues to depend on it. That the loneliness we sometimes feel in our private rooms is not a failure, but memory. The body's way of honouring the long history of belonging that made us who we are. And that the warmth we feel in genuine community, the particular rightness of being truly known by others, is not nostalgia for a world we have lost, but recognition of a world we still carry inside us, waiting, as it has always waited, for the conditions in which it can fully emerge. The night is very quiet now. The room is still, somewhere far back in time, beyond the edge of memory, beyond the beginning of history, beyond the first city and the first farm and the first permanent house. There is a fire burning in the open darkness, and around it, close together, the ancient company of our ancestors is at rest. Their breathing is slow and even. Their bodies are warm. The night holds no terrors for them, because they are not alone in it. They have never been alone in it, and neither, in the end, are we. The fire is very low, the night is long, and the sleep that comes now, as it came to them, is the sleep of creatures who are, in their deepest nature, made for each other, Rest in that knowledge. Let the walls be walls, and the fire be fire, and the long human story be what it is. Ancient, communal, private, strange, and in its quietly persistent way, still going on. Good night. There is one final observation worth making before this story truly closes. One last quiet thought to carry into sleep. Across the enormous span of time we've been considering tonight, one thing has remained constant. From the earliest bands of Homo sapiens moving across the African savannah, to the first settled villages of the Neolithic, to the crowded medieval towns, to the private homes of the Industrial Age, to the digitally connected solitude of the present, in every one of these very different social worlds, human beings have continued to do the same thing at the end of each day. They have lain down and closed their eyes and allowed the conscious mind to release its grip on the world and drift into the particular darkness of sleep. Every human being who has ever lived has done this. Every child born into every generation of our species has done it. The hunter resting near the dying fire, the farmer at the end of a long day in the fields, the medieval merchant in his townhouse bed, the writer alone at the end of a day of solitary work. All of them, in their different circumstances and their different worlds, arrived at the same threshold each night. The threshold where wakefulness ends and something older begins. Something that does not know about privacy or community, about ancient fires or private rooms, about the long arc of social history. Something that simply rests. Sleep is, in this sense, the great equalizer, the Yvonne experience that binds every human life to every other, across all of the differences of time and place and social organization that otherwise separate us. The privacy of sleep, the inwardness of this dreaming mind, the absolute interiority of the sleeping self, is the oldest human privacy there is. It does not require a room, it doesn't require walls. It existed long before architecture, long before philosophy, long before the concept of the self that deserves protection. It was there in the ancient camp, happening simultaneously, and dozens of bodies pressed together in the shared darkness, each one sealed in its own interior world of dream, even as the physical bodies touched, the communal and the private side by side always. The warmth of others and the irreducible solitude of the sleeping self, together in the same breath, the same night, the same species. That is where we are now. That is where we have always been. The room and the camp and the fire and the walls, all of it held inside the same ancient, wordless, quietly persistent act. Closing the eyes, letting go, going somewhere that belongs to no one else. Good night, and again, and truly this time you rest